Hi there, welcome to session 7 of our series on the Gospel of Mark. Today we've reached chapter 8. As always, go back and look at the gaps in between. We've missed out a couple of stories. But at the beginning of this session, we find Jesus on the northwest coast of the Sea of Galilee. He's come down from the region of Tyre, where we found him in the last session, up in the north. And he's come back down closer to his home territory. Today's session, we see 4 mini scenes next to each other, jammed one after the other. And I want to suggest to you that they all are fueled by irony. I think this is one of the funniest, one of the most comedic scenes and extended passages in the Gospel of Mark. Let me explain to you what I mean. In the first scene, we see the comedy. I can't get over how funny this must have seemed to original readers and listeners. This idea that Jesus has just healed a girl he never meets. He's fed multiple thousands of people with little more than a loaf or two. And the Pharisees come up and they say, "Come on then, what have you got? Show us something." Jesus refuses. And I think there's there's 2 things going on here. Number one, I think we as readers are supposed to go, hello, have you been listening? Have you been watching? You want a sign from Jesus? I mean, what do you call the last 7 chapters worth? Like, if that's not a sign, then I don't know what is. Secondly, the reason we're given that the Pharisees want a sign is they're trying to test him. Now, it's really interesting. The only other use of that word test in the Gospel of Mark comes in chapter 1, verse 13, where obviously Jesus is tested in the desert. Now, I think that's really important because I think it speaks to the fact that if you're going to test somebody, there's an implication that the person doing the testing is higher, right? That there's a hierarchy of some description. You can't test somebody who you don't know more than. And I think this is the Pharisees just trying to once again re-establish their authority and demonstrate that they see themselves as above Jesus. And I think the use of this, Jesus' refusal here, is a way of Jesus saying, I am under no one other than God. I am only tested by God. I only take the instructions of God. And I think that that's super important given the fact that we're getting increasingly closer to Jerusalem, and invariably we'll get to a point where Jesus submits once again to that which his Father desires. So that's irony number 1. Irony number 2, and it seems to get funnier, I described this once as a little bit like a Fawlty Towers scene, or maybe a Monty Python scene, the famous one where Michael Palin hits someone around the face with a fish. It's a very visual, kind of almost just a very simplistic level of comedy, in that you can imagine verse 14, now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread. It just makes them just seem so silly. It's just so petty almost. And they only had 1 loaf in the boat. I love those little details because they give you an insight into just how small some of this stuff might have seemed, how silly. And the bread metaphors continue. Keep in mind as we're going, remember, there's been a build-up of bread metaphors to this point. Keep that in your discussion. We've had crumbs under the table. We've had feeding of the 5,000, all ate and were filled. We've had all kinds of metaphors around yeast and bread, and track those because they're all built in here, and we get yeast back here as well. Particularly look at verse 15. Notice the 2 people who are mentioned, and he cautioned them saying, watch out, beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. Do you remember our sandwich, if you'll avoid the bread pun, sorry, our sandwich in session 5 with the feeding of the 5,000 in the middle, right? Herod on one side, the Pharisees on the other. I think Jesus is referring back to that and saying, don't be like that. And don't be like, what? Well, I think the yeast metaphor here has something to do with the fact that I'm no bread maker, but yeast only has the ability to impact that which it's mixed in with, right? So when you make bread, you have to put your yeast in your starter and then prove it. And what that means is that the yeast has the ability to act within the ball of dough that it's mixed in with. The yeast can't grow beyond its shape, yeah, with its self-contained space. And so what I want to say is I think Jesus is critical here of the fact that think back to, I picked this image up in an earlier session. In chapter 4 verse 32 we get the parable of the mustard seed, and the thing at the end of the mustard seed, just before the Gerasene demoniac story, the mustard seed ends up in a tree that grows branches that stretch out. This is chapter 4 verse 32. The branches stretch out so far that they create space for the birds to live in. So I think you've got a contrast here of yeast, the Pharisees and Herod wanting to use their power to benefit themselves. So Herod puts his yeast in his dough and watches it grow, but it's all self-contained. It doesn't stretch out. It doesn't grow beyond its boundaries, if you like. Whereas the tree, the mustard seed, that's supposed to be the example of the way we're supposed to grow, of the way the kingdom does grow, is that it starts off small, but it doesn't stay self-contained. It stretches out. It reaches beyond. And I think that's the difference here. One tiny other little thing to pick up on, and you could go to town on this, but definitely worth looking at the numbers 12 and 7 throughout Mark, particularly the reference to the number 12. Hopefully you're picking up on already the fact that this is probably significant in some symbolic way, not just in Mark but throughout the rest of the Bible. Definitely think of the 12 tribes of Israel, i.e. representing all peoples, the people of God in its entirety. In Mark alone, we've obviously have 12 disciples, but I think it's really important that we also have women representing 12ness as well. The woman who was healed from 12 years of bleeding, the girl who just happens to be mentioned, who's healed by Jesus, who just happens to be mentioned as being 12 years old, and 12 baskets that are left over. Keep that in mind when we're thinking about the symbolism of what this means for Jesus to feed all of these people over and over again, almost, in our feeding the 5,000 sandwich and feeding the 4,000 that comes slightly after. Two more quick ironies. Irony 3, we get this beautiful story that only appears in the Gospel of Mark that scholars have puzzled over because they see it as a 2-stage healing. This guy who seems to see something and then doesn't really fully see in the first instance. My tuppence worth on this one is that it's a mirror of the 2 stories above. So the disciples don't get it. Excuse me, let's go back to the top. The Pharisees have been given sign after sign after sign right in front of them, but they don't see it. They don't have the skills to see that which has been revealed to them. Disciples, they're still moaning about petty things and they still think it's about Jesus getting at them because they didn't bring bread and all this kind of stuff, and they don't have the ability to see that which is Jesus is revealing right in front of their eyes. Same here, I think. This man is healed. And he says, it looks like people like a tree's walking round. Now, the interesting thing is if he's never, we don't know if he's seen before, by the way. We don't get told whether he's been blind from birth or not. But let's assume he is. If somebody, you don't have any reference points, right? And I think this is just Jesus's way of, Mark's way of helping us as readers to understand what's happening here. The kingdom of God is being revealed before people's eyes. But neither the Pharisees or the religious leaders, neither the disciples, neither this man who's been healed have the ability, have the skills to see that which is right. They can't interpret it. They don't know what to do with it. But interestingly, this man ends up, I love this end of verse 25. Eventually, the outcome is he saw everything clearly. So for me, there's this image of what's to come. And then finally, the fourth irony for me is the fact that this story at Caesarea Philippi is just often quoted as the pinnacle of the gospel. And I love it. I do love it, but I love it for a slightly different reason than maybe lots of other people love it. I love it because it's a demonstration of the fact that as followers of Jesus, we all simultaneously see clearly, but also stumbling around in the dark. Peter gets it. He's gotten something, or his lips are able to bring to speech something that is true, that is of truth. And at the same time, he hasn't got a clue. Two verses later, in verse 32, Jesus is rebuking him, calling him Satan. And I think there's a sense in which actually there's a reality there that affects all of our lives as followers of Jesus, that we all kind of get it, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we lean into selfishness. Sometimes when we think we get it, that's when we get ahead of ourselves, and when we realize that we're not actually willing to pay the cost of following Jesus in all its fullness. So I would remind you to compare this image again to the lady from last week. We don't get to know what happens to her. We don't know what the outcome of her story is in terms of her understanding of who Jesus is. But I would say that she's bold enough, or she's presented as bold enough, to demand that which Jesus has already told her belongs to her. Whereas Peter here expresses something from his heart, but isn't willing to live with the implications of it. And so my question is, how do these two images work together and sit together? So there you go, 4 ironies for you. Questions to look at in the comments and in the notes. And I look forward to hearing how it goes. Take care.